You're tuned into Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This is episode 134, New Evidence for Icon Veneration, with my dear friend, Suan Sonna. I'm very excited for this, guys. It's been a minute since I did a podcast, so thanks for your patience and thanks for tuning in with us tonight. Before we get into this awesome presentation from Suan, we're just going to do a little plug for Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario for the best service and finest cigars. Go see Caesar and Eli. They treat all their customers like family. If you would be so kind as to go to facebook.com/Havana Palace, give that page a like. I would greatly appreciate it. All right, guys, we are back. It is Saturday and a long weekend for us Canadians. We had a civic holiday on Monday, so I'm very excited. So we have a presentation for you tonight. Well, Suan does, and it's about icon veneration, which we did an episode. Was it like two years ago? I think a couple of years ago we did Jewish roots of icon veneration. But I understand now that you've got some new material that you want to tack on and add to that presentation. So before we jump into it, tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so basically, you know that I've been focused on icons for a long time. I don't remember when exactly, like I first started doing like the stuff in response to Gavin Ortland, but like when that whole kind of controversy started, I was paying attention. I gave my initial video, which was like a short presentation, just talking about how I would probably like tackle his objections. Then I gave the 4-hour lecture, and then after that, you know, I've just been kind of making other lectures. And the research that you're getting today is the research that I'm going to publish with Brianna Elise Jansky and her husband Daniel Jansky in their book on icons with their publishing house. And so these are like really serious essays. I'm trying to condense and be sensitive of people's time, so I'm not going to like go through every single piece of evidence. But basically, this research was done while I was at Harvard, and I had access to like some of the world's leading scholars on this question. And so you're getting like the cream of the crop, the newest, freshest evidence. I think the only people who have seen what I'm going to show you today are my professor at Harvard, Giovanni Bozzana, who's like a great mentor. I love the guy. Brianna and Daniel. Those are the only 3 people who have seen this evidence. And now it's going to be you and your listeners.
Wow, fantastic. And Brianna's actually in the chat. She's watching from Texas. Right? Hey, Bri, how's it going, sister? Glad you can join us. Maybe, are you watching with Daniel? Is Daniel hanging out with you here? You can see us, both of y'all. I don't know if he's here too, but if he is, hey, Dan, looking forward to this book coming out. What's the publishing house?
It's called The Catholic Quill, and Brianna and her husband started it together. And so I'm very excited to like help, you know, do what I can to promote the book and to promote Brianna and Daniel's apostolate.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And guys, I just have to, I've told Suan this many times and I've expressed it on the show here, but one of the things that really humbles me and makes me well up with gratitude is the fact that anytime Suan has a new presentation with exciting new evidence to bring forth, for some reason, he picks my small, little, old, humble channel to premiere that information. So I'm super humbled and grateful, brother. Thank you. You could do this with anybody, but you chose me. And I just want to express how grateful I am to God and to you. And I'm so looking forward to this.
You know, I appreciate it, Dustin. And I think I told you before, like, it's because you're just a really chill guy. I enjoy being around you. I enjoy your interest in temple theology. You're just a bro, you know, and I think when I'm presenting new material and I'm kind of trying it out and I'm doing, you know, things that not many people have seen before, I think I'd like to be around somebody who I consider a really good friend.
Well, thank you, brother. That the honor is all mine. And thank you, Lord, for Suan and bringing him into my life and for his wonderful work. We're really grateful, brother. So with that out of the way, you can go ahead and share yours. For some reason, I can't figure out how to bring myself off. I can mute myself, but can't seem to find where I take myself off camera. So if you guys don't mind, I don't want to fiddle with this. I don't have a mouse or anything. I don't want to trigger StreamYard and it kicks me out because it does that quite a bit. So if you guys don't mind seeing my ugly mug for an hour or whatever, I'm going to mute myself, but I'll be in the background. So if Suan has anything he wants me to say or ask me any questions, I'm just going to hit unmute and do that. But I'm just going to be in the background, smoking my cigar and hanging out here while Suan does the heavy lifting. Sounds like a good deal to me. All right, brother, you want to throw up your presentation on the screen and we'll see if it looks good for everybody and we can see it.
So I have it ready, and I think you have to bring it on the screen though, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Okay, yep. I'll do that right now.
Let's see.
Add to stage. Here we go.
There we go.
Nice.
All right.
I love that. I love that.
Well, Dustin, you ready for me to start?
I'm ready, brother. You go right ahead. I'm just going to mute myself now.
And Dustin, you can see me change slides here, right?
Yep. Everything looks good. Yep.
Okay. Well, let me begin by thanking Dustin once again for letting me be on his channel. I'm going to try and be sensitive of people's time, as I said before. And so there's so much evidence and arguments that I can present here today, but I've decided to kind of just focus on a few because I also want you to go out and read the book and read the essays that I'm going to publish in the book that Brianna Lisjansky and her husband Daniel are putting together. So I'm just going to go through one new piece of evidence that I find very compelling and interesting for the icon veneration debate. And then I'll go into some new arguments that I'm presenting in response to Gavin Ortland. And some of these quote unquote new arguments are just kind of more precise reformulations of what I previously have said before. And some of them are actually genuinely new. And on top of that, I say it's a new piece of evidence, but it's from an old source. So obviously, new here has to be taken with that qualification. All right, so let's start off with a new piece of evidence. So the new piece of evidence is not Saint Irenaeus of Lyon because, Gavin brought up Saint Irenaeus as evidence actually against icon veneration. And I just want to say that I'm bringing up Irenaeus now because there's this very interesting phenomenon that he's attesting to in against heresies. So let me just read what Irenaeus says. Quote, others of them, that is the Gnostics, employ outward marks, branding themselves, branding their disciples inside the lobe of the right ear. From among these also arose Marcellina, who came to Rome under the episcopate of Anicetus, and holding these doctrines, she led multitudes astray. They styled themselves Gnostics. They also possess images, some of them painted and others formed from different kinds of material, while they maintain that a likeness of Christ was painted or was made by Pilate at that time when Jesus lived among them. They crowned these images and set them up along with the images of the philosophers of the world, that is to say, with the images of Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle and the rest. They have also other modes of honoring these images after the same manner of the Gentiles, or really the word there is meant to convey the pagans. What I found interesting about this quote is, okay, what's going on here is basically a form of icon veneration. Now, it's not great for our side because we would want these to be good Orthodox Christians. We wouldn't want, Irenaeus to kind of be scrutinizing them. Now, the other thing to keep in mind too is, there is a way in which you can interpret Irenaeus as not necessarily condemning the way in which they honor these images, as somehow it's the action itself that's problematic. You could say, well, it's the fact that they're Gnostics, that they're honoring is problematic. And especially the fact that I don't think any Catholic today, any Orthodox today, would venerate an image of a saint alongside Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle. So there's a lot going on here, but I don't want to distract from the new piece of evidence. But I just wanted to say it's worth noting, okay, Irenaeus writing in the 180s AD, you already see something like image veneration happening. And I found another source that corroborated Irenaeus' observation. Now, you might be surprised because it's the Acts of John. Now, some people might say Suan, but the Acts of John, it was condemned at Nicaea II. So why are you citing this condemned source? Well, I'm citing it because it provides backhanded evidence for the making and veneration of images. And so I'm going to quote actually just now from the article that I'm going to write or be published with Brianna and Daniel's publishing house. I hope they don't mind if I just kind of go into some of what I wrote. This is but a few paragraphs in a paper that I think this one was about 60-something pages. So I don't think you're going to lose too much if you see some of the paragraphs I have here. But let me just read what I have on the screen. So the 2nd century apocryphal text, Father Richard Price says soon after 150 as probable for the composition of this text. And there's some complications with when certain parts were added into the document. So maybe the original form was the early 150s, and then by the time you get to the end of the 2nd century, you have more parts added. There's a study that's been done about just kind of the composition of this text. I'm not going to get into that now, but let's just say second half of the 2nd century. That's a very reliable range for the date of this text. And what I say is that it provides backhanded evidence for, as I said before, the making and veneration of images. So in this story, St. John the Beloved is surprised to find a painting of someone in Lycomedes' possession, accusing him of still living like a pagan. Lycomedes, a pagan convert to Christianity, explains himself to St. John, saying, "He alone is my God who raised me from the dead together with my spouse. But since after God, those men who are our benefactors ought to be called gods, it is you yourself, St. John, who are painted in the image, whom I crown, kiss, and venerate as having become my good guide." The text then has John chastise Lycomedes over this icon. St. John supposedly says, "But what you have now effected is childish and imperfect. You have painted a dead picture of a corpse." Okay, Swan. Okay, so sure, Lycomedes is venerating this image, but like, how does this work in your favor when Nicaea II condemned this text? Well, let me get into that. So, Father Richard Price explains that this text is, quote, not an attack on idolatry, but distinguishes a man's external appearance and his true identity, end quote, which is what ultimately gets Acts of John in trouble. Nicaea II condemned it for denying the reality of Christ's flesh, glorifying his invisible nature over and above his visible form, which is, in its reading, a mere phantasm. Quote, "Sometimes when I meant to hold Jesus, I encountered a material and solid body. But at other times when I again touched him, the substance was immaterial and bodiless and as if wholly non-existent." End quote. The connection between preferring the invisible over the visible, thus barring images, and denying the reality of Christ's visible flesh is no coincidence. This is precisely why it was cited at Nicaea II, to the shame of the iconoclast bishops at Hieria, who had used this text against images and image veneration. So it's the reason why I'm using this condemned source, condemned on the grounds of its Christology or bad Christology, is because in denying the practice of image veneration, it has to rely upon a heretical Christology. It has to say, okay, no, the invisible world is superior to the visible world, and so we can condemn all images, and we're going to deny the reality of Christ's flesh. And this was important for the debate at Nicaea II, precisely because Christology was at the heart of the whole thing. But I just want to say, okay, you have this heretical source that is noting, okay, look, there are people like Lycomedes out there who are venerating images, and this source is saying you shouldn't do that because the invisible is superior to the visible. So the phenomenon is happening in the second half of the second century, that is image veneration, and at least this source is condemning it on heretical Christological grounds, right? It's denying the reality of Christ's flesh because it's trying to say that the invisible is superior to the visible. Now, although the Christology of the Acts of John is heretical, its value for us, as I said before, is that it indicates there were people like Lycomedes in the second century having and venerating images, right? This isn't just Lycomedes respecting an image in some generic sense. He's actually venerating and kissing the image. And perhaps, I want to say this, perhaps Lycomedes was closer to the truth than the author of the Acts of John realized. If this is correct, then Nicaea II was not a U-turn or corruption, but truly a vindication of the lived religion of the people who, from the very beginning of the faith, saw that there was a place for images and their cult. Okay, so there's the new piece of evidence. Just to summarize then, St. Irenaeus and the Acts of John show that icon veneration was practiced as early as the second half of the second century. That's not negligible. Now, this isn't to say one way or the other whether icon veneration was widely embraced or not. So I'm not trying to say, okay, from these two sources, we can just extrapolate on how all Christians were thinking at the second half of the second century. But it is to say that at least some aniconism among early Christians was rooted in heretical Christological beliefs. And so you need to take some of these like anti-image polemics with a grain of salt. You need to look at what's the reason why they're opposing images. And on other occasions, it's mixed in with anti-pagan polemics, such as, you know, St. Irenaeus saying, oh, well, they're just acting like how the Gentiles are, how the pagans are. So somebody might say, okay, Suan, this is really nice. Okay, you brought me 2 pieces of late second century evidence of image veneration happening, but it doesn't show that the apostles were venerating icons. Fine, I'll grant to you that it was an early accretion into Christianity. So before I address that claim, I just want to say once again that it's interesting to just think about, okay, you have this heretical text that is condemning this practice, but it's condemning the practice right on heretical grounds. I don't know. I don't know if we can use the rule of double negation here, where eventually you just get something that is orthodox, right? That maybe, as I said before, Lycomedes might have been actually onto something. Now, of course, I don't know if we would say that the apostles are like gods, but there seems to be something here that's worth paying attention to, right? Maybe the only problem with what Lycomedes was doing was that he didn't have the justification fully figured out, but the practice was actually fine. Whereas the Acts of John is condemning the practice because it's doing so on bad grounds. Now, on the question of whether Nicaea II allows for development, the first thing that I want to mention up front is one of the difficulties with this debate is, look, most people aren't going to read all 796 pages of the Acts of Nicaea II. Most people who are watching are either going to go through somebody like me, Jimmy Akin, Trent Horn, other Catholic apologists, other Orthodox apologists, or Gavin Ortland, right? I don't know how many people are actually going to sit down and spend the money to, read all 796 pages. So what I tried to do in this essay that I'm, sending to be published, I just try to go through as thoroughly as I can without reproducing all 796 pages what went down at Nicaea II. And I try to show from these 3 interpretive principles that Gavin Ortland's interpretation of the council is simply unsound. Because his position is that the Second Council of Nicaea, in its reasoning and its argumentation, maybe even in some of its explicit words, is saying, no, the apostles were venerating images. And I'm saying, no, Nicaea II actually doesn't say that. Nicaea II dances around that question and remains conveniently silent on what exactly the apostles were doing. And I demonstrate this through 3 interpretive principles. So the first is the principle of controversy, where basically, if the immediate context of a passage does not adequately resolve interpretive disputes, then consult the rest of the text beyond the immediate context. I mean, this makes a lot of sense. And even I think Protestant listeners could appreciate it because, they'd say interpret less clear texts in light of more clear texts. Okay, so if there's this controversy on what exactly, a certain passage means, or it could be potentially interpreted another way, you want to move on to the rest of the text to help illuminate if it will help what's going on there. And then this leads me to the second principle, which is the principle of totality, which is to interpret each part of a text in light of the whole. Gavin Ortland has certainly endorsed this principle because in his debates on slavery in the Bible, he says, okay, no, you just can't look at what happened in Exodus and Leviticus. You need to look at the entire narrative of the Bible, right? You need to look at the entire arc of Scripture. Fair enough. So let's do the same here and look at the totality of the text of Nicaea II. The third thing is the principle of rhetoric, where basically you need to be able to identify why and how rhetorical flourishes are being used in the text. By this, I mean, for example, if somebody speaks in a really triumphalistic way, like I think I've used this example with you before, Dustin. This guy says, yeah, I was talking to this girl and she was totally into me. And yeah, it was great. And then one of your friends asks, okay, but did you get her number? And then he kind of quietly says no. Then you realize he was using all that rhetoric to bombastically cover up the fact that he actually didn't get her number, but he didn't want to admit to the hurt of his own ego that, it didn't work out. So he tried to say, oh yeah, but she was into me and it was so great. He's using hyperbole and exaggeration to cover that up. Well, the more that you actually look at Nicaea II in light of the principle of controversy and the principle of totality, you actually do see that some of the rhetoric, the triumphalist rhetoric, does cover up the fact that Nicaea II is dancing around the question of whether or not the apostles were actually venerating images. It just kind of remains quiet on that point. Now I'm going to defend that thesis here, but I just want people to know that I bring the receipts, right? And I've done the research on this. So there's a particular text that I want to use to illustrate why the principle of controversy and the principle of totality are important. Because somebody might say, okay, Suan, you're going to say all this and then throw up some, smoke and mirrors, and just say, oh yeah, when you interpret the whole text of Nicaea II, you're going to get to my conclusion. But show me concretely what difference this makes. Great, let me show you what difference it actually makes. So there's a certain text that Gavin fixates upon, and it's in the 7th session of the Second Council of Nicaea. And here's what the text says: in their honor, an offering of incensation and lights is to be made, that is to images, in accordance with the pious custom of the men of old. For the honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype, and whoever venerates the image venerates in it the hypostasis of the one who is represented. Okay, so if you read this text just on its own from the 7th session, you might think to yourself, okay, yeah, it looks like the pious custom of the men of old is to offer incense and lights, or candles, basically, to images. And Gavin Ortlund certainly says this on page 213 of his book, What It Means to Be Protestant. So you could come to that conclusion if you're just reading the 7th session and you don't consult the other sessions. Like, for example, what does it mean to be a pious custom? Because Nicaea II elsewhere will say, we uphold the apostolic traditions, one of these being the reproduction of images. So it's not afraid to say, here's an apostolic tradition. It'll even say, too, earlier in the sessions of the council, it talks about how an apostolic tradition, one of the apostolic traditions that they bring up is after allegedly like a priest is ordained, he's supposed to give a profession of faith, right? So they're not afraid to say, here are what the apostolic traditions are. But here it uses the word pious custom. And it's kind of like, okay, principle of controversy, I'm just curious, is a pious custom necessarily an apostolic tradition according to Nicaea II? So I investigated this question, and over the course of my research, here's what I found. Now we pitch to the principle of totality to figure out the whole context. And so fortunately, Nicaea II does elsewhere explain what it means by a pious custom. So in the 6th session, the veneration principle, that is the honor given to the image goes to the one represented, is identified as a pious custom and an apostolic tradition. So they begin with citations from St. Basil, St. Athanasius, and Pseudo-Chrysostom. Now, somebody might say, at first glance, this conclusion seems to vindicate Ortlund, because I now have just conceded that pious custom is another way of saying apostolic tradition. However, remember that the sentence following the 7th session, or excuse me, following, talking about, the pious custom of the men of old, the sentence following that in the 7th session says, for the honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype, and whoever venerates the image venerates in it the hypostasis of the one who's represented. Notice what's going on here. Now, Nicaea II is assuming, rightly so, that you read the other sessions of the council. And so you know that when it talks about, the pious custom of the men of old, it's not talking about lighting candles and incense. It's talking about the veneration principle, because in the 6th session of the council, it says this is the pious custom. This is the apostolic tradition, the veneration principle. And on top of that, this explains why the council repeats the veneration principle in the very next sentence after it talks about the pious custom of the men of old. In other words, it's not saying that burning incense and candles are themselves the pious custom, but that these acts accord with it. So once more, Ortlund has not produced decisive proof that the council attributed any specific veneration practices back to the apostles. And so this is just a very clear example of the fact that I don't want to say whether or not I think Ortlund has read the entire sessions of Nicaea II. He certainly cited from other places within the sessions of Nicaea II. I know that for certain. But in terms of like very carefully paying attention to these phrases and these words that really, the whole debate hinges on, I'm just showing here that I don't see that type of carefulness being applied here, because pious custom is not referring to incense and lighting candles. It's referring to the veneration principle. And so, just before anybody accuses me of Suan, you're misrepresenting Ortlund. right? I just want to bring up on the screen once again what he says. So he says, he mentions the practices of, quote, prostration and bowing before images, as well as lighting candles and incense as an offering in there, that is the image's honor. Now, prostration and bowing before images is technically part of the horos, which preceded the sense. It's not technically in the immediate context of what's going on here, which is instantiation of lights. But I get what Gavin's saying. He's saying, you can kind of meld these all together. Okay, sure, that might be a reasonable inference, which he thinks Nicaea II allegedly considers the pious custom of the men of old. He then claims, quote, in maintaining this custom, the bishops insisted that we follow Paul, who spoke in Christ and the whole divine company of the apostles. So once again, I'm not misrepresenting Gavin here. I'm pointing out, no, he got this one wrong on what is the pious custom, because you have to apply the principle of controversy and the principle of totality to get the full context. And when you get that full context, only the veneration principle is said to be apostolic. And veneration principle doesn't say, oh, and by the way, here's how you specifically venerate a saint. You have to bow, kiss, and light candles to their image. No, it just says the honor given to an image goes to the one represented. It doesn't specify or demand any particular practices. So I guess, like, if Nicaea II is saying we have to preserve all the apostolic traditions, and that's one of them in this debate, I have no problem affirming that with my thesis. So it doesn't really get you to the full-throated thesis of Gavin's that the apostles were bowing, kissing, and praying to images according to Nicaea II. That's not what Nicaea II is saying. Yeah, and just I just recommend that people, if they get the chance to read the entire council, there's a lot to work through, and obviously there's so much more to talk about. So I'm not going to be able to get through everything, but really totality does matter in this debate. Okay, now to the principle of rhetoric. So my understanding of Nicaea II on this point, on whether or not the apostles are venerating images, is this. Nicaea II remained silent on, or stepped around the question of apostolic icon veneration for two reasons. One, they had no definitive evidence that the apostles themselves venerated images. None of the sources, and I do a comprehensive sweep, none of the sources that are cited at Nicaea II, except for maybe one, but I'm going to address that one, say that the apostles were venerating images. Second, they, that is the council fathers, did not wish to unnecessarily make their case appear weaker amidst the iconoclast controversy. So they're not going to go in with this kind of sophistication and nuance that, let's say, contemporary historian or scholar would try to emulate. I mean, they're going to put their best eggs forward. They're going to put their best cards forward, and try to show, okay, no, this is why we believe what we believe, and here's our best evidence, right? Covering up the fact that if you really kind of dig underneath the surface, you start seeing, okay, wait, they're kind of admitting that they don't have explicit evidence of the apostles venerating images. So let me begin by just maybe presenting two of other reasons that I give for this reading. Let's go to Father Richard Price and the fact that he translates, the Greek word horos, which is typically a definition in an ecumenical council because it's defining something in the apostolic deposit, that the apostles were doing something, that the apostles taught and believed something. The horos of Nicaea II, according to Father Richard Price, quote, does not define doctrine, but lays down practice. And hence, although horos in a conciliar context is usually translated definition, decree is most appropriate here. Now, that's important because in the very thing that Nicaea is establishing with all care and precision, they're not establishing anything particular about what the apostles were doing. There's kind of this implicit assumption, okay, if the apostles would be okay, they'd be fine with this, okay, sure. If nothing that the apostles preach would contradict the content of the horos, sure. But, to quote Father Richard Price again, some commentators have found the horos to be a thin and disappointing document. For what it formally lays down is not a particular doctrine about images, but simply that images are to be set up and receive veneration. And then Father Price says we may detect behind this the cautious sobriety of Patriarch Tarasios, eager to minimize the grounds for subsequent contention. My sense when reading Gavin's assessment of Nicaea II is that he just sees Nicaea II as this kind of bombastic, triumphalist, council that's just trying to misrepresent the iconoclast and just anathematize people. But it's interesting that even Father Price, more closely reading the text, kind of can see, okay, underneath the surface, the Horos is very strategically written. Nicaea II is being strategic. It's not just this kind of sloppy council. There is triumphalist rhetoric. They are kind of saying, this is the faith of the apostles. We've triumphed over the heretic iconoclasts. But if you pay attention, it's very carefully worded, and it's very carefully argued on what they're saying and not saying. So to quote the Horos, we therefore decree with all care and precision that venerable and holy images made in colors or mosaic or other fitting materials in the same was as the figure of the honorable and life-giving cross are to be dedicated in the holy churches of God on sacred vessels and vestments, on walls and panels and houses and in the streets, namely the image of our Lord and God and Savior Jesus Christ, of our Immaculate Lady, the Theotokos, and of the honorable angels and all the holy and sacred men. So, that's what technically Nicaea II lays down definitively. Now, its reasoning, it uses arguments, and we're going to get into them. I've already mentioned one, which is the veneration principle, which will get you pretty far. But I just want to note that from what I can tell, Ortlund has never cited the Horos in his extant work on the matter. I checked his book, what it means to be Protestant, and his other videos, and I find it kind of strange because, this is the ruling of the council. They decreed it with all care and precision. It's very important that you at least get the thesis statement right of the council that you're trying to debunk. Now to an email correspondence that I had with Richard Price. So I don't know to what extent I'm at liberty to share exactly what Father Price said and what I said, but I'm just kind of asking you to trust me that this email correspondence really did happen and that this is what the contents of that correspondence were. I just want to be sensitive because I emailed Father Price to ask if I could share what we talked about in the email, but he never said anything back. So I just want to say, I'm just going to summarize. I think I can summarize what was said in the email. So Father Price does mention, elsewhere that he thinks that the only source that potentially does say that the apostles were venerating images is the text of Pseudo-Basil, Epistle 360. And I emailed Father Price about this because I looked at the Greek. I have my own translation. And I wanted to talk to Father Price, too, about his translation in the manuscripts. But here's what Father Price does first. Apart, however, from a letter attributed to St. Basil the Great, but manifestly a later concoction, no passage from this period, the 4th and 5th centuries, which is the pivotal period, the golden age of the fathers, which Nicaea II is relying upon to get back to what the apostolic doctrines are, was produced that expressed approval of the actual veneration of images as distinct from using them as an aid to reflection and stimulus to prayer. Now, I have some quibbles here and there because I think there is some evidence of something like veneration, that was cited and mentioned by Nicaea II in its defense. Like, for example, St. John Chrysostom's homily on Meletios of Antioch. I think that one probably counts as something like veneration. I don't know if we should have such a strict definition of veneration, but what goes on in that text, which I think I do cite here, is pretty high praise for an image of a saint among one of the principal Golden Age fathers. But leaving that to one side, if we just go with Father Price's quote here, all I have to technically do then to end this debate is to figure out what did St. Basil the Great say, or Pseudo-Basil say. Because if it's true that Pseudo-Basil, really did say that the apostles were venerating images, okay, Gavin's got that one, right? He's right. Because if that's what the source says and they're citing the source knowing that that is what it says, then you would use that in the principle of totality to make sense of the later comments in the council. But fortunately, that's not what Pseudo-Basil even says. So I have the Greek there, and I provide my own translation. And here's what my translation is. And you can see, too, in the actual essay, I cite other translations as well, so nobody can say, oh, Suan, that's just your translation of the text. Other scholars have backed this point. Therefore, I also honor and bow before the characteristics of their images, and especially in accordance with those ones that have been handed down from the holy apostles and have not been forbidden, but in all our churches, these ones are represented. So the question before us is whether or not what is handed down from the apostles. The argument that I made is that what is handed down from the apostles is the images, right? I also honor and bow before the characteristics of their images, especially in accordance with those ones that have been handed down from the holy apostles. That's where the holy apostles come into this whole sentence, and have not been forbidden, okay? Presumably by the apostles. But in all our churches, these ones are represented. And I talked to Father Price about the translation of this text, and basically, there's one part of the council where pseudo-Basil is cited, and then later in the council where it's cited. And I noticed that Father Price, used a different conjunction, and I was kind of worried, like, okay, because the conjunction might actually make a difference. Because let's see here, I think the difference is that if that last but is actually an and, then you could actually interpret it as saying, okay, the apostles, let's see here. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what exactly it was, but I talked to Father Price about this, and I just said, because one translation can make it sound like, what is not forbidden. What is not forbidden is the veneration. But I said, Father Price, doesn't it make more sense to say that what's not forbidden is the holy images? And he kind of looked at it and he said, oh yeah, that actually does make sense. So that's why, and it's because the but in all our churches, these ones are represented. It's contrasting something that came before. It's trying to say, these aren't forbidden. Well, what's not forbidden? It's the images, because why? They're represented. It doesn't. The concern of this passage is not to establish that veneration has not been forbidden. The concern of this passage is to establish that the putting up of images in churches is not forbidden. And so I talked to Father Price. I presented my kind of arguments, and he gave the green light. Yeah, that makes sense. And I asked him, like, okay, you translated the second time with the and at the end and not the but. And I asked him, is that because of the manuscripts? And he looked at the manuscripts and he said, oh, no, actually, it should have been but again. I just chose to translate it as and. Now, that actually does make a difference here, but Father Price was able to confirm that should also, again, be an al or Allah, which means but in Greek. So I hope that was clear enough to explain to the audience. Like, what's being forbidden, or what's not being forbidden here is, and the focus of the passage is not veneration. What this passage is just trying to show is, what was not forbidden by the apostles, what was handed down from the apostles, were images, hence they're represented in our churches. And whatever, it says, therefore, hothen, there was a theological argument preceding, this particular excerpt that I took out. And that theological argument talks about how, the saints are great, the Blessed Virgin Mary, all that. But the choice to honor and bow before the images is the conclusion of a theological argument about the nature of the saints. And then the only time that the apostles are brought into the equation is not to show that veneration is okay. They're using the apostles, even in this synonymous text, this forgery that could have said anything it wanted to, that images were handed down from the apostles. They're not forbidden, and they're in all of our churches. That's the thing that was not forbidden. Right. Okay. So, there you have it there on kind of how I apply the three interpretive principles. There's much more that goes on. I'm just kind of giving you a few of the highlights in the essay. Now, the second thing I want to bring up here is, whether or not Nicaea II is a valid development. So we're going from the question of whether or not Nicaea II allows development to whether or not it is a valid development. And I think we need to stop and just think about really quick, what are Ortland's arguments against the validity of Nicaea II? And I deduce that Ortland is defending three basic contentions. The first is what I'm going to call the no precedent contention. So what he's saying is that image veneration practices lack sufficient historical support to such a degree that Catholics and Eastern Orthodox cannot defend Nicaea II as a development. And he comes to this conclusion by virtue of what I call like the lowest common denominator reading of his historical sources. You know, remember he gave that 1 hour, 15-minute lecture going through several different historical sources, beginning with, I think, Irenaeus and ending with Pope St. Gregory the Great. And he basically, he looks at what is the lowest common denominator that all these sources share, and do these is this lowest common denominator Nicaea II? Well, no. None of them fully articulate the whole doctrine of Nicaea II, the whole vision, the whole theology of it. So then Ortlund says, okay, well, look at this lowest common denominator here, and none of them are saying that you can bow, kiss, pray, venerate images in that kind of way. So that's how he gets to his idea that there's no precedent for the teachings of Nicaea II. The second contention that he raises is what I call the no recognition contention. So he says that Nicaea II's teachings on image veneration would have been rejected by early Christians had they heard it. Or that's my summarization of his point, but he basically says the same thing. So I just want to emphasize that the no precedent contention and the no recognition contention are different arguments, and that Gavin can't switch between one or the other if he's pressed on, let's say, the no precedent point. Because with the no precedent point, he's just saying, here are the sources, and here's the lowest common denominator that they all share. They might have disparate positions about images. Some might like images. Pope Gregory thinks that there's a good didactic reason. Origen thinks all images should be outlawed, right? Yeah, okay, whatever. There might be differences here and there, but the lowest common denominator is they're not going fully ahead with Nicaea II, bowing, kissing, praying, lighting candles, so on and so forth. But there's a difference then between that and the no recognition point, because the no recognition point is actually a very strong evidential claim. I sat down with a professor or associate professor at Harvard's classics department, and he's a scholar of Byzantine papyri. He looks at Byzantine texts, and we were going through kind of just the basics of the literature on this question and all that. And I asked him, what did he think about this particular argument? I didn't say Gavin made it. And this professor looked at me and he said, that's a very speculative type of argument to make. Now, that's not necessarily bad, but it just shows that there's a high burden of evidence then, right, to make a claim like that. Because, and I'm going to go into this as the presentation moves along, there are some cases in which I'm not sure actually what a certain church father would have thought about images, because they say nice things about a certain image of a saint, and I don't know what they would have thought about the whole canon of Nicaea II, right? They say really nice things about images. I don't want to say that they would be against Nicaea II. So some of the sources are actually, the history is actually more complicated than what Ortlund is saying, and there are situations in which I'm just kind of like, maybe I'm just agnostic about maybe what this father would have thought. But because it's Gavin who's insisting on the no recognition thesis, he has to bear that burden of proof. So he kind of backed himself into this corner. The third thing I want to say here is that he makes the claim, right, that image veneration simply has non-apostolic origins, right? Ortlund explicitly says that the practice of venerating icons does not date back to the apostles or anywhere remotely close to them. Okay, so let's just kind of look at what my responses are to Ortlund. The first thing I look at is the representativeness of his historical case. And by that, I mean, to what extent has he fairly characterized the historical situation between Christians and art before the 8th century in which Nicaea II took place? And what I show in my paper is that there are actually key pieces of evidence that complicate Ortlund's characterization, and that Ortlund essentially gives us a skewed picture of things. I mean, it's not surprising, because if Ortlund chooses, if he just is looking at the lowest common denominator, and I made this point in my first ever presentation in response to Ortlund, it was that video, like I think it was less than an hour on my channel when I first got into this debate, where I was just like, I mean, but if you use that lowest common denominator reading, yeah, of course things look bad. But if you emphasize or look at the fact that there is a development actually, even in Ortlund's sources, where you get from Origen to Pope St. Gregory the Great, and how over time there seems to be a bit more warmth towards images, you actually can see the development. So the framework that you choose, the lens that you choose, I guess it gets you the result that you want. And I'm trying to say here, well, let's look at all the evidence. And there are actually key pieces of evidence that kind of make us call into question, has Ortlund fairly characterized the situation before the 8th century? And I would even be willing to say here that I don't even think some of the scholars in the field, not all of them, but some of them have also not fairly characterized the situation before Nicaea II. And in fact, other scholars are now admitting, yeah, we've been a bit too Protestant in our reading of history, and we've moved along from that. I'm going to back that claim up. The second thing I look at in the essay is whether or not Scripture supports something like icon veneration. So I look at the apostles, ancient Judaism, ancient Israel, and I just show that, yeah, the situation actually with images in ancient Judaism and ancient Israel is much more complicated, and it's not this neat type of Protestant aniconism. I used to think when I was Protestant, yeah, they were, ancient Jewish people were totally opposed to images. I don't know where Catholics get their crazy ideas about images and statues of Mary. And then when I actually looked at the evidence myself, and I was surprised, they actually were much warmer than people realized towards images and iconography. It's much more complicated. The last thing I'd bring up is just looking at, each of Gavin Ortlund's historical sources. I'm not going to assess each one of them, but I'm going to show you, if you're a Catholic and an Orthodox person watching this video, and you've dealt with, Protestants who have brought up these quotes from all these sources, how do you deal with them? I'm going to give you the playbook on how to deal with it. So the representativeness point attacks all three contentions of Ortlund's presentation, of Ortlund's case against the validity of Nicaea II. And I'm just trying to emphasize here that Father Price notes that Nicaea II did have some serious evidence in its favor, right? And Father Price brings up the fact that, John Chrysostom referred with approval to the popularity of images of the recently deceased Meletius of Antioch. This is a kind of silver bullet in the iconophile case, because the whole debate between Nicaea II and the Synod of Hyria, the iconoclasts, was who has the support of the Golden Age Church Fathers. If you get somebody like Chrysostom on your team, that's huge. And here's what Chrysostom says in the key part of his homily on the death of St. Meletius. What happened was a lesson in devotion, for led continually as they were to remember that name and to keep that saint in mind, they used the name to banish all irrational emotion and thought. And this became so frequent that everywhere, in the districts, the marketplace, the fields, and the streets, his name re-echoed from all sides. So here's the veneration of a saint. The name is being used almost as if, I don't want to say magic or a spell, but that's kind of a close parallel. Even in exorcistic literature, even in, I think, incantation bowls, you find the name of Jesus being used by Jewish people to exorcise demons. So there's a lot of power in the name of somebody, and that was the view in antiquity. You have been affected not so much by the name on its own as by the very form of his body. For what you did with names, this you have done with his image as well. For many have impressed that holy image on rings on the finger, on cups and on bowls, on the walls of rooms, and indeed everywhere. So it was not only to hear that holy name, but also to see the form of his body everywhere and have a twofold consolation for his departure. So two things here. If we took a time machine and went back into Antioch around this time period, you would walk into the homes and the shops of the Christians living there, and you would find images of St. Meletius. It would kind of look almost indistinguishable from a modern day Orthodox, icon shop or business that has, a portrait of a saint up on the wall, right? The second thing is, Gavin might say, okay, fair enough. This was going on in the time that Chrysostom was writing, 4th century. Sure. Now, what he would say is, this isn't, let's say, veneration. This isn't all that Nicaea II is saying about bowing, kissing, praying to images, so on and so forth. Okay, sure. But neither can you conclude with your recognition contention that, or no recognition contention, that John Chrysostom would have stood opposed to Nicaea II. In fact, if I were a betting man, I would say I think John Chrysostom would be fine with Nicaea II. And that's a big deal, because in the eyes of the church, not all sources are equal. And I shouldn't even say that. In the eyes of everyone involved in this debate, not all sources are equal. Like, Gavin specifically chose particular saints and Christian apologists, people who were not, let's say, I mean, Tertullian, he does cite Tertullian, but he's choosing sources that have some type of authority in witnessing to the practices of the early church. So if we're looking at sources in terms of their authority, John Chrysostom is pretty high up there. And this is what he's saying about images. So I don't think you can just neatly make the no recognition point. But if you can't make the no recognition point, it also means that the no precedent point is skewed. It's not fair. And it also kind of calls into question how confidently we can conclude that a church father like Chrysostom, who has a good grasp of the apostolic teaching and preaching, can we conclude that, or what's stopping us from concluding that Chrysostom has the right apostolic mindset here? Right, that he understands what the apostles would have said were they exposed to something like the full canon of Nicaea II's veneration practices. Now to my point on ancient Judaism and ancient Israel, which also, if this point goes through, it attacks all three contentions, right? Because if it's the case that actually ancient Judaism and ancient Israel was much warmer to images than people realized, and that the early church fathers that, or early church sources rather, that Ortlund cites that are hostile to images, you see actually kind of a road bump rather than a continuous tradition against images. So let me say this, quote, another problem I will mention here is that Ortlund says far too little about the apostles in ancient Judaism. A defender of Nicaea II can capitalize on this gap at the beginning of Ortlund's presentation by providing evidence for a cult of images, a cult of saints, and the fusion of the two by or in first century Palestinian Judaism. Insofar as this case is successful, it can undercut Ortlund's by vindicating Nicaea II as a continuation of the apostolic heritage. Now, I'm not going to defend here the cult of saints because I've already done that before on this channel, on my own channel, that there was a cult of saints in first century Palestinian Judaism. It was quite robust. It had the idea that saints could intercede and even intercede for the dead. If you don't believe me, look at the presentation and look at the sources. So if this case is met with immediate skepticism by Ortlund, Joss Elsner notes, and this is in the T&T Clark Handbook of the Early Church, quote, in the case of ancient Christian art, get this, the excessive Protestantism, which determined the pure faith, quote unquote, of both late ancient, or that's me saying, quote unquote, not him, of both late ancient Judaism and early Christianity to have been aniconic, probably anti-iconic, even iconoclastic before the 3rd century AD, has been rightly corrected. Notice that we are at a point now where scholars are beginning to recognize, yeah, we were being excessively Protestant in the past. Scholarship is now adjusting. We're now realizing things are a bit more nuanced, a bit more complicated. Robin Jensen says the same thing in the very opening chapters of her book on From Idols to Icons. So I'm just pointing out here that this is what the cutting edge is saying, that we can't be excessively Protestant. And I think that a lot of Gavin's argumentation reflects that relic of past scholarship to be excessively Protestant. Now, I do also want to be fair and say that Elsner does say, though, that he thinks the current consensus, but notice he says current consensus on the enthusiasm of early Christians for art is probably also excessive. So whether or not you agree with Elsner, that's a separate question. But at least he's acknowledging that the current consensus of scholarships, while Gavin Ortlund is writing and publishing his book, is actually that early Christians were enthusiastic for art. That's worth noticing because I don't think I ever see this claim or something like it acknowledged in Ortlund's book. This is what the cutting edge is saying. History bears out a more complicated story. So let me give you one particular instance. When you look into the book of First Maccabees, chapter 13, verse 27, around that particular context, Simon Maccabeus, he's the brother of Judas Maccabeus. Daniel Schwartz, in his recent commentary, dates this text to 110 BC. I know that's a bit controversial, but I'm going to run with it because that's what the latest scholarship is saying on Maccabees. What this text says is that Simon Maccabeus creates these elaborate tombs and monuments for his deceased family. So he says things like in First Maccabees 13:27, these monuments were so high for his brothers and father that it might be seen with polished stone at the front and back. And for these same men, but including this time his mother, Simon, quote, erected 7 pyramids opposite one another. And then these were surrounded by great columns. And on the columns he put, or in the Hebrew, Schwartz says, or depicts rather, suits of armor for a permanent memorial. And beside the suits of armor, he carved ships so that they could be seen by all who sail the sea. And remember, the events of the Maccabean revolt, we're talking like 160s BC. So just looking at the surrounding context here, what we see actually is, in this case in which the sovereignty of the Jewish people has been restored against the Seleucids, against the enemies of Judea, when Simon Maccabeus celebrates, he carves images. He sets up images. He sets up monuments in memory of his family. When's the last time that we saw in ancient Jewish history an explosion of images? The last time that we saw this kind of explosion of images was the Temple of Solomon, when King David is shown to be this loyal son of God, imperfect, of course, but he is a man after God's heart. He gives the plans to build a temple to Solomon. Solomon finishes it. And that was a time when David had successfully defeated the enemies of Israel. This was a time of peace. This was a time of great success, security in ancient Israel. And it's precisely when the ancient Israelites had sovereignty that then images could be brought in. There's an essay that I cite. I don't mention it here, where it talks about basically, I think it's Joseph Gutman, I think is his name, where he talks about how the reason why like images were more tightly controlled. This is a Jewish scholar. Were more tightly controlled in like the Book of Exodus, where it literally says no images carved whatsoever are allowed. And then you see later Jewish people making images. At the time of the Exodus, because the ancient Israelites were wandering in the desert and vulnerable to the surrounding pagan cultures, if I can call them pagan cultures, because the cult wasn't secure, because their nation wasn't established, they didn't have firm, secure walls and a king to really govern and protect the temple and sanctuary. God's like, okay, you're not going to depict anything, because the moment you start doing that, you're going to start slipping into the other cultures. But once there is sovereignty, once there is security, Temple of Solomon, Davidic dynasty, okay, you can have images. You can have more images. And the images in ancient Israel weren't just the ones that were divinely commissioned. You also find images outside of the temple, even later, like King Hezekiah, his royal seal has an ankh, and he has the the winged sun on his royal seal. I don't remember any divine commission for that image, and King Hezekiah is supposed to be this iconoclast. Eliakim, the steward, the chief steward of Hezekiah, also has his own. It has images on his seal. In fact, if I have it here, yeah, you can see on the Intellectual Catholicism merchandise, the seal of Eliakim is there with 2 does. Right, that's a carved image of something that is living on the earth. Regardless, you see here evidence then that there's this correlation between when the Jewish people, when the cult, when the sanctuary is protected and safe and established, then you can have images. But when it's not, okay, then it's going to get too close to paganism, and then we might slip in and become pagans. But then this has ramifications for the church then. What happens when the church is secure, when the church has its resources and it's able to practice freely? I mean, those are just some questions that you can ask. There was one scholar, John Finney, in his book, The Invisible God, who just says that early Christians used the pagan images around them, but reinterpreted them with Christian meanings. And that was their form of iconography, of I guess you can call it icon veneration. So that in reality, when you look at ancient pagan images, you might actually be looking at things that were used in early Christian art quietly to be reinterpreted, like the image of the Good Shepherd with the lamb around the shoulders. That was a pagan image that was reconverted, or turned into, rather, a Christian image. Okay, and I just wanted to show you a fun bit here, which is that we have actually a shard of pottery that dates to either 81 to 117 AD, and it's an image of Moses. So this image of Moses is the first time that we see in our historical record among the ancient Jewish people of a depiction of the human form. And this possibly dates back to the 1st century. Now, once again, with all historical research, we're getting fragments of the past. We're not getting the full detail. But, we have the Magdala synagogue that has images. Other research has been done on other synagogues in the first century. I know Magdala definitely has images. I think there are others that did have images as well, but not of the human form. But this has an image of the human form, and it possibly dates back to the first century or either the very early second century. So I guess the whole idea that ancient Jewish people were just so opposed to images and they were like pious Protestants, and okay, that's getting overblown now. The last thing I want to mention here are Ortland's sources, right? So remember, he lists those 7 or 12 sources rather, supposedly showing, right, that this was a later accretion and not possibly something that goes back to the apostles. The other 2 arguments that I presented in this presentation, at least this half of the presentation, the ones preceding this point, that's going to deal more with, what were the apostles possibly doing. But I do want to say here that one thing that I found interesting is this. If you're a Catholic, if you're an Orthodox, and you get hit with these kind of machine gun citations of these early Christian sources, you don't have to submit to any one of them with, let's say, the assent of faith or religious submission of intellect and will, just to use like technical jargon. But like, you don't have to say, oh, well, if this guy doesn't have the full doctrine of Nicaea II, then I'm doomed. No, why do we have to interpret the church fathers that way? You see, as Catholics, we have this idea known as theological notes. And I use this in the back of my mind to help me address Gavin's sources, because what you basically do with the practice of theological notes is you figure out the degree of magisterial authority behind a certain teaching. So some things are dogmas, some things are doctrines, some things belong to the ordinary magisterium, but still, they're exercises of the authentic magisterium. So you owe it religious submission of intellect and will. To get to the bottom line here, I basically weighed each of Gavin Ortland's sources, and I said, how seriously should we take this one? How seriously should we take that one? Because you don't have to just lay back and say, okay, I guess you got all these machine gun citations against me. That's not how that works. This is not scripture. This is not something you can just pull proof text. It's not all on the same plane. It doesn't all have the same weight. And I noticed that, I think, let me be controversial here, because of this difference between Protestants and Catholics, I started noticing that Protestants would cite the church fathers against us the same way that they would cite scripture against us, as if we viewed scripture and the church fathers as necessarily equal. But that's not how we view the church fathers, and that's not how we weigh the historical evidence. We can do, historical studies as well, and evaluate how much is the source really worth in the debate. Is it a drop in the bucket, or is it the atom bomb? Okay, so, right. Ortland mentions, for example, that, let me just quote him. So he says, quote, Octavius, that's the Christian in the dialogue. This is the Octavius of Munitius Felix. His response is basically to say, because God is invisible, just like Deuteronomy 4, like we'll talk about later, God is invisible, God is brighter than light, therefore we do not represent God in any way. That's the argument of Octavius in this dialogue. John of Damascus will later argue that the incarnation somehow has changed something that was lost on all of the ante-Nicene Christians. Nobody had this thought of, oh, well, because of the incarnation, it's changed now. So one, this is extremely unfair to John of Damascus, and I'm going to show you why in the next slide. But it's worth thinking about, like, does the incarnation make a difference in this debate? Have all the ancient Christian, early Christian sources parse through the ramifications of the incarnation for images? So, for example, let me give you a concrete example of why the incarnation actually matters in this debate and should not just be dismissed, why John of Damascus is actually onto something. As Ortland notes, quote, early apologists like Justin Martyr and Athenagoras, for example, ridiculed the pagan practice of making images to be invoked and revered, whereas the true God, they insisted, was invisible and distinct from matter altogether as the creator and sustainer of all things. Okay, so the argument here of these early apologists and other Christian writers against pagan images was that the true God is invisible. But is Jesus Christ not the true God and visible and having a material, corporeal human nature, can I not look at that image of Jesus and say that is the true God? In that one question alone, you can see then why the incarnation matters for this debate and why John of Damascus should not have been dismissed so lightly. And on top of that, this was the central debate between the iconoclasts and the iconophiles in the 8th century. Ortlund demonstrates some knowledge of this component of the debate, but I wouldn't say it's enough to show that he really understands what the iconoclasts, the iconoclasts were using the incarnation and Christology to defend their position. And Nicaea II responded with their own Christological points. But this is the central question at the time of the 8th century, right? Jesus Christ is the true God. Okay, but the true God's invisible, so can we depict the true God? The Catholic brothers and other people have brought this up. This gets into the debate on the communication of idioms, the relationship of Christ's divine nature to his human nature, so on and so forth. But the point here is that a lot of these early sources, even Christian sources, when they insist too strongly on the invisibility of the true God, you kind of know at that point they haven't really fully parsed out all the ramifications of the incarnation. So John of Damascus is 100% making a valid point. Okay, so now let me give you some rules, right, for evaluating when you get hit with these sources from Protestant apologists. So the first thing you should pay attention to is if a source changes in a more iconophile direction, then that should at least preclude confidently concluding that such a source would have opposed Nicaea II. Eusebius of Caesarea is one example. Gavin cited Eusebius's letter to Constantia as evidence that he was very opposed to depictions of Jesus Christ, and everywhere this was supposedly banned, although Eusebius is clearly exaggerating there. Then you go on later into Eusebius's life, and he writes the life of Constantine. And he says that Constantine has an image of the cross of Christ, and he was moved by divine love to put it up. I wonder if it's also an image of not just the cross, but of Jesus on the cross or something like that. Leaving that off to one side, the position of Eusebius towards images seems to change near the end of his life. And then even I mentioned in the book too, or excuse me, in the book, my specific chapter, how Eusebius even recognizes in his ecclesiastical history that there were images of Peter and Paul and of Jesus elsewhere throughout Christendom, throughout the Christian world. So then when he says that everywhere this is banned, but then he cites in ecclesiastical history, oh, by the way, there's a bunch of pagans, I guess, who converted and they're still holding on to their images. I don't think Eusebius is being totally clear there. He's not being totally consistent, right? He's exaggerating to get across his particular viewpoint. Right now, the communication of idioms, that should make us hesitant to fully embrace early sources that insist rather recklessly upon the invisibility of the true God, while ignoring or failing to fully appreciate that Jesus Christ is the true God and visible. Remember, the communication of idioms is this idea that what is predicated of the divine person can be predicated of the human nature and vice versa, but what is predicated of the divine nature cannot be predicated of the human nature. So I can't say, for example, the divine nature is immaterial, the human nature is immaterial. No, I can't say that. But I can say, God, Jesus died on the cross. I can say God died on the cross. Why? Because the divine person of Jesus is God, right? Jesus is God. So I can say that. Some of these sources don't seem to have fully thought through what they're saying when they insist too strongly that the true God is invisible. I mean, there should be some type of caveat or qualification there. Even Clement of Alexandria, or I think it's Clement of Alexandria or Origen, they get into some dicey territory because they acknowledge the Logos became incarnate, took on flesh. But then I think it's Clement who says, yeah, and if God took a human form to himself, that would be crazy. And it's like, wait, but you believe in the incarnation. But there is a charitable way to interpret that where it's not denying the incarnation, right? The charitable interpretation is that he's not saying that God can be fully constrained and like taken out of heaven and just rammed into like a body and lose all of his omnipotence. That's not possible. I think that's what Clement is trying to say there. But the point is, like, you know, that kind of gets a little close into some dicey territory. When you see that you have theological opinions rather than the claim to be handing down apostolic tradition, that should make us more willing to challenge the intellectual merits of a source's opinion and the extent to which an opinion is particular to that source. So, you know, for example, if someone is making a philosophical argument against images, and that's their philosophical argument, that doesn't tell us anything about what the apostles thought about images, right? That's that particular theologian's arguments. And insofar as he's an individual theologian, I'm going to challenge him on philosophical, theological grounds. And also, on top of that, too, like, you can't assume that that particular theologian is representative of everybody at his time, right? Origen represents Origen, Clement represents Clement, except in those cases where you can tell that they're relaying something that's more ancient and widespread. And just on that point, like, just insisting that God is invisible and therefore we shouldn't have images, that's kind of a weak argument. And so I'm kind of willing to say that some of the early sources that were trying to, you know, develop and invent their kind of apologetics against images had bad arguments. So I'm willing to say that. So I don't know, that's like kind of water off my back. Also, the pagan context of these sources should make us consider the extent to which a source fairly considered the possibility of good and Christian uses for images, or if they were overly pessimistic and cautious. I use the example in the paper of, you know, I came from a Baptist family that didn't believe in alcohol, or believe in drinking alcohol. And I know that for some people, that's because they had, you know, maybe alcoholism problems in their family. And so for them now, like, alcohol, beer, is just so tainted that you can't even tolerate a drop. It's just bad. I think most people, even Gavin, because he offered me to get a beer once, or we agreed maybe to get a beer. We agreed that, you know, that's an extreme position, but it's a position that's kind of rooted in trauma to come to this radical conclusion that no, alcohol, there's nothing good that can be about it. Now, of course, I don't like comparing images to alcohol because the images, you know, they're very wholly separate thing. But I'm using it to just illustrate a point, which is that if you have this traumatic history with a certain thing and you see something associated with it, it tends to lead to these same types of radical conclusions where some of these early Christian sources are saying nothing is good about images. Images are just bad. They're just horrible. That's an extreme position. Even Gavin would say that's an extreme position. Why can't I say that's an extreme position and say, yeah, I mean, I don't have to accept that as like binding authority upon me. On top of that, there are relevant theological differences between pagan gods and saints. You know, Gavin cites Augustine, his homily on, I think it's Psalm 115. And it's weird to use Augustine to defend that case on like the images of saints and venerating them, when Augustine also, because Augustine in that passage is condemning pagan gods and the use of their images. But how can you go from what Augustine thinks about pagan gods and images to what Augustine thinks about Christian saints and their images, when in fact Augustine explicitly defends the veneration of Christian saints against the charge from pagans that it's no different than the worship of pagan gods? That complicates the whole picture. You can't just neatly assume that Augustine would have been opposed to Nicaea II either. On top of that, like, when a source simply disapproves of images or the cult of images, if there really isn't like an explanation offered, or it's just very thin, I think that should also temper our confidence in its relevance toward Nicaea II. Like, for example, if let's say a source is opposed to images and it's because they think only God can be invisible, and then that makes you stop and think, going back to the communication of idioms point, what do you think about Jesus Christ then? And Gavin would surely recognize that if a source has a heretical Christology and that's the basis for opposing images, then who cares what that source thinks? And I'm kind of saying we can use that same principle and dial it down a bit, because I don't think, you know, all the sources that he cites or any of them actually have a heretical Christology. Certainly not like Irenaeus and the others. I'm not saying that. But we can use that in a lesser form to qualify them nonetheless. So I do that with each and every source that Ortland cites. And what I show is that in the history of Christianity, just as when you look at the history of the ancient Jewish people, I mean, actually, there's a lot I can get into the theology here. But whenever God draws closer to his people and there's finally security within the cult, within the sanctuary, then you see the explosion of images. Similarly, with God becoming incarnate, and you can actually see the true God, the invisible God made visible. And you finally have at a certain point, after paganism is taken down and Christianity rises up, and Christians are finally safe to practice their religion, you see Christians using images. You see an explosion of images. So one hump actually in the development towards Nicaea II was to get over our pagan trauma as Christians. I'm going to put that on the table. That was one thing we had to get over, because then we became excessively Platonic. It's funny when you see these sources complain about, the pagans, the pagan converts still holding on to their paganism. When you see some of the early Christian sources holding on to a Platonic view of reality that's like extremely Platonic to the point where it's not compatible with the Christian faith. Now, I'm not saying that Platonism is bad necessarily. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that it's kind of unfair when they also have things to work through themselves with their pagan background. And they're using these arguments from pagan thinkers to condemn all images, to condemn all representational art, when not even the ancient Jewish people, their predecessors in the faith, went that far. Yeah, and Ortland makes this claim that Origen's teacher, Clement of Alexandria, was arguably more aniconic, but that's just false. Clement actually allowed images, but he just said that they have to be reinterpreted for Christian edification, right? So he says if you have a ring, if you have an image, you can interpret that in a good way. Like, for example, a dove is going to be the image of the Holy Spirit. A ship is going to be an image of, of Christ or something like that. Whereas Origen just thinks images should be totally outlawed. And so it's funny because you have this case where the student is more radical than the teacher, which shows you already we're not dealing with apostolic tradition. We're dealing with individual theological opinions and arguments, right? Right. And so I have just have this image in the background from HBO's The Young Pope, which, it's a little blasphemous at times. Or yeah, it is blasphemous at times. But like, it's a fun show. And there's this line in the show. It's not recommended for families. Even I was kind of shocked at but I didn't know any better because I was very new to HBO. But leaving that aside, haven't watched it again. There's this line where this actor, he says, the young are always more radical than the old. And I kind of was reminded of this with Origen and Clement of Alexandria. But there you have it. I presented the new piece of evidence. I went into some of my new arguments on Nicaea II, particularly how to respond to the question of does Nicaea II allow for development, and respond to the question, is Nicaea II a valid development? So that is my presentation, Dustin. Sorry, I went a bit longer than I hoped.
No, brother, thank you. That was fantastic. And so much was going on in my mind while I was listening to you and watching you lay out some of those sources. I don't want to tack on too much to your presentation. I just want to let it speak for itself. But a couple of things you mentioned were interesting. Well, more than a couple, but some things that stood out to me. You mentioned Hezekiah's seal.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how there was an ankh and a winged sun disk. Interestingly enough, so you're putting that on a royal seal. And obviously Hezekiah is quote unquote Orthodox. But yet he's using these images from Egypt. Right. So what that shows me is similar to how the Christians appropriated and baptized pagan symbols and images. Jews were already doing that. So we have a precedent there with the Egyptian symbols. They didn't see anything wrong with it, but rather they repurposed it and made it onto something holy. Right. And the same thing is what the Christians were doing with appropriating pagan art and symbols. So I find that interesting. And I really like what you said, too. Getting over this trauma, and once things were secure, then we see a flourishing of, iconography, images, veneration. So yeah, you mentioned Israel, like they're coming out of Egypt, they're coming out of a pagan culture, right? So obviously things are going to be very strict, but once Israel is settled, secure, then not coincidentally, I think you find an explosion of images. So, and the same thing in the early church, right? They're so concerned with pagan idolatry, just like Israel at its early stages. Once the Christian church is settled and secure, then you see. So there's really a precedent. There's
Oh
almost
my
a
gosh.
direct
Yeah.
parallel in Israel.
It's so crazy. Like when you start seeing like these things, like, well, you see history kind of repeat itself, right? Because, you know, it's one thing because Ortland, one thing I talk about in the paper is that I can tell like Ortland has a very specific idea on how the Bible has to lay out doctrine. So if it's actually doctrine, the Bible has to say it this way, very explicitly, very clearly. And this type of overarching kind of, you know, you look at principles and you look at prior precedent, then you kind of make these principles right based on the history of the past. He doesn't like those types of readings, except when it comes to slavery, you know, in the Bible. So he'll say, oh, but no, the progressive arc of scripture is going to be against, you know, slavery at some point. Okay, so he does it there, but not here. I'm saying, like, with the historical record, you can actually see, Dustin, what we're talking about, where the prohibition on images and the disgust towards it is always conditional. It's always conditioned around the surrounding culture and environment. But then you see, once again, you know, once there's security, once the cult's been established, then, okay, we can have images, you know, things are okay now. So, and the thing is too, you know, I talked about like the pagan trauma we had to get over. When it wasn't to invent something new. When we got over the pagan trauma, we were going back on the trajectory that ancient Israel and ancient Judaism had already set in motion.
Right.
We had to get over that speed bump.
Yeah, very good. Another thing I wanted to mention too, and not a lot of people bring this up, but so you're looking at the veneration of images, right? So what is the object of veneration? It's not the medium,
right?
It's not the wood, the stone, it's the saint that is the object of veneration through these media, right?
That's right.
So at the same time, images are being kind of poo-pooed. You have the veneration of relics still happening simultaneously. So the veneration of the relic is supposed to pass to the saint. Right. So if you're going to say, you know, this is not apostolic, you have at the same time, you have the veneration of Elijah's bones, right, in the scripture. You have the collection of Polycarp's bones in AD 80. And so you have the veneration of relics, which is clearly spoken of highly in a positive way from St. Augustine. So in the same sort of picture, where in the background you might not have express veneration of images, you do have express veneration of relics, because it's the same, it's going to the same place, it's going to the saint. And what might have developed more were the media, the stone, the carving, the colors, whatever. So this might have undergone some development. But what is the same is the veneration of the saint. That's always been the case.
Yes. So, you know, the core of Nicaea II is this: the honor given to an image goes to the one represented, and we can venerate people, right? We can venerate saints. You just put those two things together and you get Nicaea II.
Right.
And Nicaea II is pretty clear. Like, you know, it explicitly says that the veneration of saints is an apostolic tradition, and it very clearly says that the veneration principle is apostolic. And Nicaea II kind of puts the pieces together and says, here's our doctrine, here's what we believe, here's what we teach, you know. So you're right to point out that you need to have the first development with the veneration of saints, but that was very early on. And then I think here's the point, Dustin. It's kind of like you have these magnets, right, that were left behind by the apostles. Okay, the veneration principle, it's attested to in the book of Colossians when it talks about, you know, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God, and how this was used by Athanasius and Basil to say that we don't divide up God into between his image and his substance, the Father, because the image is consubstantial in a sense, especially in the case of God. Bottom line, my point is that there's good precedent to think that the veneration principle is apostolic in some form. There's good reasons to think that the veneration of saints is apostolic. You put those two things together, and you get Nicaea II. And so, I mean, you're making a totally valid and correct point there, Dustin. There's something else I wanted to say, but I think it escapes me at the moment. Oh, I wanted to pull up I forgot to mention this in the presentation, but I thought it might be of interest to you, Dustin. Basically, what I did in my essay is I listed out everything that Nicaea II considered to be an apostolic tradition in its text, and that just kind of seals the deal that it did not consider explicit veneration practices to necessarily be apostolic. Not saying that they weren't, but it's just saying, like, that's not how we're making our case.
Right.
Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so here we go. Okay, yeah. So let me share my screen again, Dustin, so I can show it to the audience. Once again, This is also cutting edge. Okay. Nobody else has seen this except for not even a handful of people. Nice. You see my screen?
Yeah, let me just put it up here. Okay.
Okay, so it is now clear which traditions and beliefs were considered apostolic in origin by Nicaea II and used in their argumentation. So declaring one's faith upon priestly ordination, that's said to be an apostolic tradition. The veneration of saints, obviously, the veneration principle, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the making and having of images is explicitly said to be apostolic. The use of images in the cult of the saints in some way, the presence of images in churches, the refusal to apply, the prohibition against graven images in the book of Exodus, against Christian images, and the belief in the good use of images. So, like, those are the apostolic traditions mentioned at Nicaea II. I don't see anything about lighting a candle or bowing or kissing.
Right. It doesn't list it there. That's right.
Yeah.
And, for our purposes, because we've done a lot of Jewish roots episodes, and all of this can be traced back to the Israelite faith in the temple in some form or fashion. So it's not like it popped out of nowhere after the pagans encountered Christianity. Then we start to see this come out of nowhere. No, it has its precedent and its root in the Jewish faith.
Right. Like, for example, the act of like kissing the image. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we have any like ancient Jewish sources of anybody kissing an image like that. But I think the practice is rooted in that was a biblical form of greeting and reverence, to bow and to kiss somebody. Mm-hmm. So one case is, I think in the book of Exodus, Moses bows and kisses Jethro, his father-in-law.
Right.
So that was just viewed as a biblical greeting, a sign of love and affection. And because we love the saints and we view them with affection, we use the image as a way to communicate, those things to the saint whom we love as a family member. And on top of that, Dustin, you mentioned the point about how, we honor ultimately the one represented, mm-hmm. right? We don't honor the thing itself as if it is the, saint in question.
Yep.
I mean, that's precisely right. John of Damascus says we don't venerate the paint. We don't mm-hmm. venerate the wood. We venerate the one represented. And Nicaea II has this beautiful line that I think even Protestants will like. Nicaea II has this line where it says, and even the honor that we showed to the saint ultimately goes to our Lord Jesus Christ.
Right, right.
Nicaea II takes care to say that even our love for the saints is ultimately in glory to Christ. Yep. I mean, that's a beautiful Christocentric understanding, the proper understanding of what's going on when we venerate a saint. We're looking at the painted object. We're looking at, this is a great analogy. We're looking at the painting and its beauty, and we're saying, wow, it's beautiful. How much more beautiful must the painter be? How much more wonderful that this could exist in the mind of the painter. I mean, slam dunk right there.
Absolutely. And when we venerate a saint, and that's just it. When we venerate the saint, we're ultimately venerating Christ, because anything exactly. that they are is because of the life of God dwelling in them. And the wonderful things that they did was God's life and power in and through them. So ultimately, when you crown a saint for his or her virtues or what have you, you're ultimately crowning Christ.
Right. I'm crowning, Christ in them, and just how beautiful Christ made them.
Yes, and
continues to make them. Yeah.
Right. And we should expect this. Our faith is, if it's truly incarnational, God is not in competition with his creatures, but fills them with his life. Then this is not detracting from the glory of God, but it's showing how beautiful and wondrous it actually is.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
One thing I did want to mention, because you mentioned bowing and kissing as a form of showing like affection and deference and all that. Well, I posted this quote a couple days ago on Facebook. It was, I think it was for First Chronicles, when it's saying how the people of Israel, it was when Solomon was crowned, It says the people, in most translations, it says the people bowed down before God and the king. So you have God being bowed to, and in the exact same, frame and
Hmm.
sentence, the king is also bowed to. And in the King
Oh
James
man.
version, it's
Hmm.
really explicit. It says the people worshiped God and the king.
Hmm.
That's literally what it says, worshiped.
So, oh man, so once again, I have to sing the praises of Brianna Lee Stransky because she brought my attention to this passage, and it's with King David,
Right.
um, and you see this weird thing going on in ancient Israel, if I can say that without being irreverent, where the cult of God and the cult of the king are melded together,
Absolutely.
which is obviously foreshadowing, the incarnation when the king is God and God is the king. But you know, when I was Protestant, I kind of just thought, okay, yeah, that's not going to happen. There's going to be a very clear understanding, soulless, yes, all glory to just God alone, right? And then you start seeing in ancient Israel that even then, you had the cult of God and the cult of king being mixed and matched together. Now, and even I think it's Psalm 45, which says, God, your God said to my God, so on and so forth. Like the king is addressed as God.
Yeah, the king is actually it's in the same it's the same series of verses where the queen mother is lauded too, by the way. So the king is your throne, oh God. The
Yeah.
king is called God, but then God also has a queen mother. So there's an interesting foreshadowing of the incarnation, the Davidic king, and the queen mother. But the king is called God in the Old Testament. So
Right.
I mean, that's pretty. That's nothing to hand wave, I don't think.
And the point I think that, and I mentioned this in the book, or yeah, in the essay that I write, and I mention it in the context of the fact that, like, when God actually starts dwelling really closely with his people and the cult is finally secure, you start seeing them cross boundaries that you
Mhm.
originally thought couldn't be crossed. Like,
Right,
could you imagine um, after the Exodus, while they're in Sinai, anybody claiming to be God or being called or addressed as God?
right.
Like, no. But by the time you get to King David, something happens. And I
Mhm.
would press anybody to figure out, why is there a change here? And the moment you do that, take that same principle and just apply the reasoning consistently. We don't need an explicit formulation of, okay, here's what's going on here in this passage, like
Mhm.
Gavin seems to think, um, if the Bible is actually teaching something.
Very
And he's
good.
gonna, and I to be fair, he might say I'm being uncharitable there, but I don't think that's far off from his actual position, given what he's written about what he thinks the Bible. He gives characterizations on what he thinks the Bible needs to say for like
Mhm.
image veneration to be valid. He thinks that he said in response to like my arguments on the chief steward that the chief steward has to declare a dogma. I'm like, to count as like a type for the Pope, or yeah. And I'm like, come on, like
That's the thing with, and we've talked about this before. We've done an episode on typology, and I remember you saying, and it's a great point. I mean, for a typology to be valid, there
yeah,
doesn't have to be a one-to-one correspondence on every detail.
that's right.
Who made that rule? Just doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, and it's conveniently applied because on the issue of like slavery in the Bible, as I said before, Gavin will bring out the whole, oh, you got to read the whole context and the whole scripture and
Hmm.
come up with these overarching. And then it's funny because then you see like the atheist scholars, become the more conservative Protestants essentially, and they say, no, you can't do that. Historical, grammatical reading only.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's very selective, right? When it
Yeah,
comes to a certain issue like slavery, well, let's look at the overarching context and the whole picture. But when it comes to images, no, it has to be these tight, compressive
yeah,
categories, and that's
yeah.
not consistent.
Because, like, yeah, I mean, with the issue of like slavery in the Bible, you don't get like an explicit condemnation against the institution. But what Gavin's going to say is, oh, but if you look at the trajectory of the Bible, you see that it's leaning
Mhm.
in that direction. That if that's not good enough in the Catholic debate, why is it good enough there? You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
true,
Yeah.
true. Yeah, absolutely. Well, brother, when is this? I know it's part of a book, but when do you think this book and the chapter therein that you've contributed. When is this supposed to come out? Any projected date there?
You have to ask Brianna, but I think it's going to be like next calendar year. Like, I don't
Okay.
think it's going to be necessarily anytime too soon. So you still have to wait a little bit.
Well, this was a good
Yeah.
teaser to get us ready. So,
Yeah, that's right.
hey, listen, man, I appreciate all your hard work. Thank you so much for the service you do for the Holy Church, and it's so appreciated. And thank you just for, everything else aside. Thank you for being a great brother and friend. I really value your friendship, and I think you're amazing. I can't praise you enough.
Oh, Dustin, it's my pleasure. I love being on your show. I love our friendship. I love your audience, and I just love your passion for the faith. I love everything that you say about like temple theology and your interest in especially Our Lady and the Queen Mother. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise, brother. Well, we're going to end it here, guys. So you've been tuned into Holy Smoke, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This was episode 134, New Evidence for Icon Veneration with Suan Sonna. Okay, with that, guys, we're going to wrap it up here. You have a good night and a good weekend. All right. God bless.